Hi, it's September 2020, and we are in the middle of a pandemic, unfortunately. And for the past several months, many churches have been holding worship services online. Our church has been doing it on Zoom, and recently the church reopened, and now we have this kind of hybrid church service where some of the people are in the sanctuary and some of the people are on Zoom. And setting up a system to do this kind of thing is not trivial, and I expect that's why you're watching this video. And so what I'm going to do in this video is share the things I've learned, help you understand what your options are, help you understand what some of the pitfalls are. Now, I should say our church is small, and so one of my goals is to do this very cheaply. So not buying a whole lot of equipment, kind of managing with what we have. A second goal is to set this up in a way such that a single person, the Zoom host, can remotely control the whole thing on a Sunday morning. The video has three parts. In the first part, I'll show you at a fairly high level how you connect your sanctuary to Zoom and what your options are there. In the second part, I'll talk about, well, I'll give a demonstration of our system and what it looks like on a Sunday morning from the perspective of the person running the system. And finally, I'll talk in some more detail about some of the issues that I didn't talk about earlier that are going to be important to you. So the basics for live streaming are that you have some cameras and some mics in the sanctuary so that people on Zoom can see and hear what's going on in the sanctuary. And if you want people on Zoom to be seen and heard in the sanctuary, you can also add a Zoom display and a speaker in the sanctuary. And those things may not be as important as the camera and the microphones, but they can be useful at times, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So let's start with the cameras. Unless you have a really nice camera that can give you a full view of the sanctuary and maybe then zoom in all the way on the pastor, then you're probably going to want multiple cameras. And that was the case for us. We had no cameras and really couldn't afford to buy a real fancy camera. So we have three cameras and three camera views. So the views are, first of all, the pulpit. So when the pastor is speaking, you're going to see him. The second one is sort of this view that shoots across the front of the sanctuary, which allows us to see the person reading at the lectern as well as to see the pianist. And the third view is something that we don't use too much, but it's a camera up in the corner of the sanctuary that looks out on the congregation so that people in Zoom can see who's out there, which is kind of nice. If you have multiple cameras, there are two approaches that you should consider for controlling the camera selection. That is, which camera view that the people on Zoom will see. So the first approach is that you hook all the cameras to a single Zoom computer in the sanctuary. And the second approach is that you hook each camera to a separate Zoom device. So you can see the first approach is on the left, the second one is on the right. So in the first approach, if you're a person out on Zoom and you're looking at the gallery view, for example, you're going to see a single participant that is the church. In the second approach, you're going to see three different participants, one corresponding to each camera. So as the Zoom host, you're going to want to control the camera view. So how do you do that? Well, in these different approaches, it's very different how you control the camera view. In the first approach, you're going to have to go to the Zoom user interface of the Zoom computer in the sanctuary and select the camera from there. So I don't know if you've ever noticed that there's the little icon down at the bottom of your screen where it says stop video and there's a little up arrow next to it. And if you click that, you can select which camera to use. So most people at home are always using the same camera, so you may not have noticed this, but you can have a lot of different cameras and you can choose from among them. In the second case, uh, there's only one camera on each Zoom device, but now you have three video feeds coming into the Zoom meeting. And so the host needs to control which video feed the people on Zoom see. And he's going to do that through the spotlight feature of Zoom. So in some ways, this is a little nicer than having to go into the Sanctuary user interface. Because if you think about it, here are the trade-offs. If you take the first approach where there's a single Zoom computer, and if you're trying to remotely control this, then you need to log in remotely to the Zoom computer in the sanctuary to be able to change which camera is selected. Whereas if you're the Zoom host in the second approach, you just use the Zoom Spotlight feature, which is just built into Zoom, makes it easy to change what people on Zoom are seeing, and it doesn't require you to kind of do this remote control thing. Uh, a second thing, however, is the amount of equipment. So if you look at this picture, you can see on the right side, looks like there are more computers involved because each camera has to be connected to a separate computer. However, it may not be quite as bad as that looks because one thing you can do is use virtual computers, virtual machines. So you would have one physical computer, and for all these Zoom computers, you put a virtual machine in your physical computer so that there really aren't more physical computers. And I've done that, and if you care about that, you can put something in the comments and I'll explain more. Another possibility is that you use a smartphone for one of the cameras, and it kind of combines the camera and the Zoom computer. So you can run Zoom on the smartphone, and that can work pretty well. However, it does have some limitations that I'll talk about later. A third thing you might need to be concerned about is the bandwidth. So when you look at this picture, you can see on the right side, there are 3 video streams always feeding up from the sanctuary into the network. So if you have FiOS or a lot of upstream bandwidth, it's not a problem. But if you are on very limited, if you have 5 megabit upstream bandwidth, then this is probably something you need to take into account when you're deciding on which approach to use. So what about sound? Sound is really important and can be hard to get right, but the good news is that you probably have already done all the hard work if you have a sound system in your sanctuary. So you probably already have some microphones feeding into a mixer, which then feeds an amp and which drives some speakers. And if you have a setup like this, all you really need to do is take an output from the mixer and connect it to the audio input on Zoom, and you are done. In addition to live streaming from the sanctuary out to Zoom, you might also want to show Zoom people in the sanctuary. So in our setup, as you can see here, there's this 36-inch TV. It's kind of big, but not huge. That's what we happen to have. And it's on the side, in the front, where everybody, including the pastor, can see it a little bit. And the purpose isn't to hold conversations with people on this TV, but just to have a feel that the people on Zoom are there with you in the service. And in fact, most of them probably will have their video off, but at least you can see a square showing that they're there with you. So it's sort of this way to have people on Zoom be present in the sanctuary in some small way. And it's not that hard to set up. You also might want to have a way for folks in Zoom to be able to speak into the sanctuary. So again, this is not something you're going to use a lot, but it can be useful. So we use a sound bar, which we happen to have, which just connects to the TV, and now we have sound from Zoom into the sanctuary. Very easy to set up. Another possible option is to take the audio out from the Zoom computer and plug it into the input of the mixer so that it's heard over the church sound system. And I haven't tried this. I think it'll work. Or you could just connect some external speakers to the computer. Um, in any event, we keep this disabled during most of the service, but we enable it during our time of sharing joys and concerns where people on Zoom want to ask for prayer requests and they want people in the sanctuary to hear them. Um, One thing you do need to do is if you have a speaker in the sanctuary, you have to make sure that all of the audio inputs in the whole sanctuary go through the same Zoom device as the speaker, or you're going to get feedback. And one other thing, you may think, well, this seems kind of worthless having this speaker and display there, but it also uh, is good for if you have guest speakers or musicians who are out there on Zoom. And for example, our pianist recently had to quarantine, so she just played from home. And so all her music was heard in the sanctuary. It was kind of neat. Okay, it's time for a demo. So before we get into the demo, this is the configuration of the system that you're going to see in the demo. So in the church sanctuary, we have a single computer, and the audio input for that is coming from the church sound system mixer. And the video is coming from 3 cameras, just like I showed you those 3 camera views before. We have 3 cameras. One of them is a webcam that is mounted on a mic stand kind of directly in front of the pulpit, staring the pastor in the face. The other 2 are actually old smartphones that they're not running Zoom, but they're running apps that turn them into wireless webcams. And I'll talk about that some more later. And then at the bottom, you see the display and the speaker that I just talked about. So out in Zoomland, I am the host. I am not in the sanctuary. I'm in my home running this thing remotely. So I have the normal host duties of on a Sunday morning of sharing the bulletin so everybody sees it, of making sure everybody stays muted like they're supposed to, and that kind of thing. But I also now have additional duties of selecting the camera view that people on Zoom are going to see from the sanctuary. Okay, let's look at what it's like to run the system remotely. So to kind of get you oriented, there are going to be a number of displays and they're sort of laid out like this. So first of all, if you have two monitors, it's good. You can have host Zoom on one monitor, and on the other monitor, you can do all your remote management stuff of the things in the sanctuary. If you don't have two monitors, I don't have two monitors. It's best to use virtual desktops. If you have not used virtual desktops in your life, this is a good time to learn how. It's very easy to learn, and it's very, very good productivity sort of thing. And it runs on Windows, Linux, Mac, whatever. So I really recommend virtual desktops. Basically, with a keystroke, you can kind of go from one whole set of windows to another whole set of windows. If you have Zoom host in one desktop, you can, in one keystroke, switch to a set of windows that are that are your remote management windows. So really nice to have virtual desktops. Okay, within this monitor or virtual desktop that's has all your remote management stuff, I'm going to be running TeamViewer, and there are going to be two tabs, and one of them is going to be the remote phone. So you'll be able to see, I can, just like I were in front of a phone, I can scroll it and touch it and that kind of thing. The other tab is the remote computer, the remote Zoom computer, and I'll be logged in there. Now that remote computer actually has two monitors on it. Now, you only saw the one big monitor in the sanctuary, but it's really, really helpful if you have two monitors. They don't have to both be real monitors. The big one has to be real, but the other one can just be a sort of a stub. You can buy a little dongle that you put on your VGA port or whatever. It'll make it think there's another monitor. And then when you log into your remote control software, you will have basically two virtual monitors. This is within the remote management window for that computer. So then you can switch between those two monitors. You'll see what it looks like. But anyway, there's going to be one remote monitor that will show the display, just like it's showing in the sanctuary. It's going to be the gallery view of Zoom. And on the other screen, on that computer, you're going to do administration stuff. And the reason you want to do this, you want two monitors there, is because if you think about it, you're doing things maybe on that computer. Maybe you're playing with Zoom, the controls to zoom cameras in and out, or maybe you're playing with the sound icon. You don't want the people in the sanctuary to be seeing that. You'd like uh, that Zoom display just to always be up there in the gallery view. You don't want to have to be having things flash on and off there. So that's why it's good to have two monitors like that. All right, so let's run the demo. Okay, let's pretend it's Sunday morning. It's maybe an hour before worship, and we want to set this system up before the worship so it's all ready to go. I'm doing this. I'm at home right now, or I could be in a different room in the church, but I am not in the sanctuary. So I'm going to be the host. Like any other Zoom meeting, I'm going to start up the meeting. Okay, I got Zoom started. We'll make it full screen. Okay, now I'm going to switch to a different virtual desktop or different monitor if you have two monitors. And this is the interface to TeamViewer, which is our remote connection software, remote control software. You'll see there are two things that I'm configured to control. One is what says church. That's the Zoom computer in the church. And the other is a phone that's up in the corner of the sanctuary. So let's log in there first. We'll get connected to the phone. And so this is the phone interface using TeamViewer. I can swipe it with the mouse. Let's go. Sometimes a little tricky. Okay, and then I can do what I would normally do with the phone. I can tap buttons. So I have, you'll see there's IP webcam here and DroidCam X. So I'm going to, on this phone, I'm going to run DroidCam X. You might remember I actually have two smartphone cameras in the sanctuary, and when I went to the remote control here, you only saw this one. That's because the other one is, it's an old phone. It's too old to run TeamViewer. Has a decent camera though. So on there I have this IP webcam running, and it just runs all the time, so I don't really need to log into it. And in fact, for this phone, I can just start DroidCam X and just leave it running. I don't actually have to remote control these phones when they're being used as IP webcams. If I were using them to log into Zoom, I would certainly want to be able to remote control them because every time we start a new Zoom session, I'm going to have to come to the phone and log it in if I'm using it in Zoom. But right now, I'm going to just use it as webcam. So we'll run DroidCam X. It's up, it's started, and I can just do that. It's still running. Let's now go back to the main TeamViewer interface and let's remotely log into the church computer, the one in the sanctuary. Okay, so we're in here. You may recall that there are two monitors in the sanctuary. One is the big one that everybody sees. The other one is something I can use for control purposes. And that's what we're staring at right now, is kind of this second monitor on the computer in the church. And in fact, it doesn't actually have to be a real monitor. You do need a computer that supports two monitors, but if you can buy a little dongle stub thing you put on the back of your computer to make it think there's a second monitor there. And if you do that, when you remotely log in, you will have two remote monitors. So this is the one. Using this icon at the top, I can switch to the other one. So now we're looking at, and let me just go full screen with this. So now we are looking at what people in the sanctuary will be seeing. They're going to be seeing this big monitor. So I want to get it set up before the service. They shouldn't have to look at this screen, me fooling around with it during the service. Actually, I have a shortcut here, which just jumps me right into the church Zoom meeting. So let's start up the video. Okay, so now what I'm seeing, this is the host's video. He has it turned off, so I'm just seeing the profile picture. And this is the camera view in the sanctuary. So I have 3 cameras set up in the sanctuary. This one is a smartphone. It's the one that I can't log into remotely. And it's looking across the front of the sanctuary. So if the pastor happens to wander away from the pulpit, you'll pretty much see him in this area in the front of the church, which is good. This is also where our reader is. If we have a liturgist or a reader, they'll be standing at this lectern, so we'll see that. And this is where our pianist plays. So this one camera view captures a lot. And I'll show you a little later how I can actually zoom in. So let's say there's somebody reading here. I can zoom this picture in so you'll get a close-up, or I could zoom in so you'll see the pianist a little bit better. So when I'm doing this, here, let's go full screen on this as well. Okay. And again, this is what they're seeing in the sanctuary. And of course, during the service, there's a lot more than 2. Right now, we're just seeing the 2 cameras, the host and the church. But when everybody else joins Zoom, you're going to see piles of squares here. If I want to change cameras, because I'm using this solution where there is a single Zoom device in the sanctuary and all the cameras are connected to it, to change cameras, I come down here and I click this thing. And now you'll see all the cameras that can be selected. Now, I actually only have 3 of these that work. This MPEG one, which is this view, the DroidCam Source 2, which is the one I configured a little while ago that's up in the corner of the sanctuary, and then the Logitech camera, which is staring the pastor in the face at the pulpit. So by the way, here you can see just up in the corner, this is one of the smartphones that's mounted on a microphone stand and is looking out at the congregation. So let's see what that view looks like. So I'm going to switch to the camera view, which is right there where you see that camera looking out. So that's DroidCam 2. And when I switched to that, oh, it didn't work. And I forgot to set it up. So let's go over to back to this thing. And here's the DroidCam control. And I'm going to start it up. I'll move this over. So this is the view of the sanctuary from that corner camera. And I can actually zoom it in using this control if I want to get a little closer, which is kind of nice. Okay, well, maybe that was a little much, I don't know. So let's switch back to this view, and now when I go to that DroidCam 2 source, now I'm seeing the view from the camera up in the corner of the sanctuary. And again, I can zoom this in and out. And finally, I have the view from the pulpit. And there it is. So there, of course, nobody's there right now, but this is where I would see the pastor. So I'm going to, during the service, I'm going to switch a lot of times I'll be right in this view watching the pastor as he preaches. Sometimes I will switch to this view when the pianist is playing or when the reader is reading. And maybe before the service or during prayer time during the service, I might, not that one, I might switch to this one where I'm looking out at the congregation. So people out on Zoom can see who's in church. Okay, so let's go back. So again, during the service, I want to not be messing with this display any more than I have to, because this is what people are looking at during the service. I will have to come here to change the camera view. But other than that, if I want to do anything on this computer, I want to do it from this display, because people in the service are not seeing this display. So I'm going to mute this for the moment. So what's going on here? This is actually a control for one of the smart cams, the IP webcam thing. And I just click here and it tells me that the camera works, and you'll see that that camera is sending 960 by 720 resolution data to the computer. Now that doesn't mean, and if I use a newer camera, I'll get higher resolution. That doesn't mean that's what you're going to get on Zoom, because there are a lot of factors that go into the quality of the video you see on Zoom. So one of them is the camera. And if you're using your smartphone as a camera, another is the application that you're using to make it into a webcam. Like in this case, it's IP webcam is the name of the application. And in another thing that comes into the factors into the quality is the computer itself in the sanctuary. If you have an underpowered computer, it will probably drop back to doing lower quality video. Your upstream bandwidth may come into it. So I don't know how the Zoom algorithms work, but they will change your video resolution on the fly. And I think some of it also has to do with the Zoom network itself, the Zoom platform, because with the pandemic, there are so many more people using Zoom that they're trying to scale up their operations, and I think the video quality might suffer in the process. Anyway, that's just to say that if your video quality isn't what you think it ought to be, there are a lot of areas where you should look to see if to improve it. This is the control for that webcam that looks across the front of the sanctuary. You can zoom the camera in and out using this. You can, just like I did over here for this camera. So I'm just trying to show you the different ways you can control these cameras. And there's some other things you can do with that camera. More ways to do fine-grained control. One other thing you will want to control in the sanctuary is the sound coming into the sanctuary from Zoom. So we have a sound bar connected to the TV, which is this display, and the sound can be controlled down here through this thing. Let me move this out of the way. So during the service, not often, but a few times, mostly we're going to keep this sound turned way down. You can basically keep it muted for most of the service. But then when we get to the time for Joys and Concerns, where we want people in the Zoom to be able to speak into the sanctuary and be heard by everybody in the sanctuary, we can enable this. So now people if I'm out on Zoom and I'm talking, people in the sanctuary will hear it. Otherwise, I keep it muted just in case people in Zoom accidentally unmute themselves. Let's flip back to the host interface. So again, this is what I'm seeing during the host meeting. And during the meeting, what I'm going to be doing is my usual Zoom kind of things here. I'm not seeing this quite right. So I'll be sharing the screen. I'll be bringing up the participant list and that sort of thing. But I'll also be switching back to here and maybe zooming in and out here, and occasionally switching over here and changing the camera angles. So these are the sorts of management things that I'm going to be doing during the service. One last little tip I'll say is about screen sharing. So during the service, I often share the screen. We share the bulletin. I don't know how other churches do this, but so there it is, and I can kind of flip pages, and everybody out in Zoom land is seeing this. Now in the sanctuary, because I'm sharing this, this is also going to come up on the screen. This is the big screen in the sanctuary now that we're looking at. That I just flipped to. And people in the sanctuary don't need to see the bulletin up there. First of all, they can't read it because it's going to be too small, and secondly, they have a paper copy of it. So really would rather this didn't show up here when I share the screen. So what I'm going to do is go to side by side. Let's see, I am in side by side view. Sorry, what I'm going to do is, I am in side by side view. I want to be in side by side view. If you're not, do this, but then drag this and make it really small. Now, whenever I share something, it will look like this. And then when I stop sharing, it will go back to looking like this. So I don't really, whether I'm sharing or not sharing, I don't have to go over to the remote control for the monitor in the sanctuary. I can just kind of leave it as is. So this is a quick demonstration of the approach in which you have a separate Zoom device for each camera in the sanctuary. So there's a separate Zoom connection to the meeting from each camera in the sanctuary. In this demonstration, I have 2 cameras in the sanctuary that are connected to Zoom directly. So one is showing the pulpit here. So that's the same computer in the sanctuary that I showed previously. But now one of the webcams, the one that was up in the corner of the sanctuary, instead of operating as a webcam, I'm running Zoom on that phone. And that phone, so now is directly connected to the Zoom meeting, as you can see here. So what this allows is that I don't have to go into this remote management thing and log into the computer in the sanctuary to be able to change the camera angles, to be able to change which camera people in Zoom are viewing. Instead, I can do it using the Zoom interface. So right now I'm in gallery view, but let's say we go into speaker view, and now I want, let's say, so this is the view that I'm seeing as the host, and of course people out on Zoom can change their view to be whatever they want it to be. They don't have to see this. But I can kind of encourage them to see this, so I'm using the spotlight feature. So I can go here, and by the way, let me rename this. It's a little confusing. It's called Rick. This is really the church. Okay, so let's spotlight the church. Now, it looks the same on my monitor, but if you were on out there in Zoom land and you were in gallery view or something, all of a sudden it's going to pop up and it's going to show you this. And this is what you're going to be seeing is full screen. You're going to be seeing the pastor preaching. Now let's say the pianist starts playing and I want to switch cameras. All I have to do, well, actually, I don't have my view of the pianist, but let's say I want to switch cameras to show the congregation. I can go here and spotlight that. I'm going to have to cancel this other one first. And now I see this view out over the congregation. So the point is, using the regular Zoom interface with spotlighting, turning spotlighting on and off, I can switch cameras, which is a really nice thing to be able to do. One other thing I should point out is that you may have noticed here, and I'll go back here again, that the video in this picture is pretty bad. And that's because I am running Zoom on this old smartphone. I got a lot better video out of this camera, out of this smartphone, when I was using it just as an IP webcam. When I do it like this, not so good. So I suggest that if you are using smartphones as cameras, that you experiment to make sure you're getting the video quality that you want. Okay, I hope you enjoyed the demonstration. I now want to spend some time revisiting a few things that I sort of glossed over earlier. And the first of these is the question of where is the host? So you might think that the host would be in the sanctuary in front of the Zoom computer. I'm not so sure that's a good idea, as it can be distracting to others in the sanctuary if the host is clicking away on the computer or talking to people out on Zoom. So I think it's best if the host is either in a different room in the church or at home. Another thing you need to give some thought to is where you place equipment in the sanctuary and how that placement affects the way in which you interconnect pieces of equipment. So for almost any connection between pieces of equipment, you're going to have a choice of wired or wireless. And generally you want to prefer wires because they tend to be more reliable and they're easier to configure and they have better performance. But sometimes, because of the placement of the equipment, wireless is going to be a better choice. So if we look at our sanctuary, you see a picture of the sanctuary on the left and our kind of figure of all our equipment and interconnections on the right. And the figure on the left shows where this equipment sits in the sanctuary. And you can see that most of the equipment is on the left side, sort of grouped together. So it's relatively easy to run wires among those pieces of equipment. But something like the smartphone webcam, which is number 9 in the figure up in the right, is sort of far away from everything else, and it really needs a wireless connection to the computer. Also, the computer itself is pretty far away from the router, which is not in this picture, it's in the back of the sanctuary. So we have to use Wi-Fi there, even though it would be better to use Ethernet. So as you're thinking about where all the equipment's going, you're really going to have to think about wired versus wireless connections. So another thing I mentioned earlier was the fact that limited bandwidth can be a problem. So this is not a problem. This is not going to be an issue for everybody. It happens to be an issue in our church, so I'm mentioning it. Your upstream bandwidth is going to be used by all the connections from Zoom computers in the sanctuary into the network. Also by the remote control software, which is sending the image of the Zoom computer display back to the host, assuming the host is somewhere out in the internet. And it's also being used by anybody in the sanctuary who just happens to be using the network. So if you only have 5 megabits per second upstream internet service, you might want to experiment to make sure it can handle the load that the system's going to put on it. So I think each Zoom video stream uses somewhere between 1 and 2 megabits per second. So if you have a few video streams going up, all of a sudden you're up to 5. It's also a good idea to have a router that can limit the bandwidth used on the guest Wi-Fi network if your upstream bandwidth is limited. And most routers also have a way to show the amount of bandwidth that's currently in use, so that's kind of a good thing when you're trying to figure out if it's going to work, to be monitoring how much bandwidth is being used. One other thing is Zoom can give you some statistics about bandwidth, as well as some things about video resolution. So I show them here on this screen. You can see the bandwidth used on the left and the video resolution on the right, and that video resolution will change, by the way. It's kind of interesting to watch what Zoom does as you change your view and that sort of thing. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is remote control. So I didn't really talk about it while we were running the demo, but you saw that we're using a remote control product called TeamViewer, and that has a free license for non-commercial use, which is great. There are other good remote control options, such as Remote Desktop and VNC and other things as well. What I like about TeamViewer for this particular use is that it's really cross-platform, so it can run on most smartphones as well as on computers. There aren't that many remote control software products that will run on smartphones. Another thing I really like about TeamViewer is that you can securely connect to computers that are behind a firewall without having to set up a VPN or without having to set up an SSH tunnel to get through the firewall securely. So that's pretty nice. Okay, and the last thing on my list of random things is equipment. What equipment do you use? And this is something you're going to be giving a lot of thought to. Let me start with the computers. If you happen to have decent unused computers lying around, that's great. I don't think most of us do. You might be tempted to use a computer that's sometimes used for other things during the week, but I think it's a lot better to have a dedicated equipment for this, because you're going to want to test this system. You're going to want to work with it at times other than Sunday morning, and it's a problem if the computer is not there. And you also just can run into problems when people are connecting and disconnecting things and restarting things. It's better if it's just always there, always running. A decent computer doesn't have to be expensive. You probably think, oh, buy a computer. And I think it's partly because we have a mindset of buying laptops. You don't need a laptop for this. Laptops are generally more expensive than equivalent desktops. So I got a plenty powerful refurbished desktop computer from Amazon for $111. Came with a clean copy of Windows 10 Pro and also a 60-day guarantee from Amazon. So that's been working great, and I'm really happy with it. Speaking of computers, you might have a computer already in your sanctuary that you use for projecting PowerPoint. We don't have that, but if you do, you might be able to use that as your main Zoom computer, but you better think that through because your AV person's going to be using it. In any event, if you do have to project PowerPoint during the service, you're going to want to figure out how people on Zoom are going to see that PowerPoint. So one way is to run Zoom on the computer that's running the AV stuff, and then just share that PowerPoint. So even if that AV guy is not the host, he can still share. He could be a co-host or something. Another way is just have the host have a copy of the PowerPoint and he can share it at the same time, and I'm sure there are other ways to do it as well, but these are just things you need to think about. Little thing is adapters. I had to get an adapter to go from the mixer output to the computer audio input. I had to get an adapter to go from the DisplayPort output of my computer to HDMI. So you're going to just find you need to buy some adapters. Most of them are pretty cheap. So let's see, a monitor. If you decide you're going to have a monitor in the sanctuary, the simplest thing is just to use a TV. If you don't have one at the church, if you don't know somebody who has a spare old TV, you can get one for less than 200 bucks. And by the way, a lot of people now have 65-inch TVs, and maybe they have an extra 40-inch TV you can have. Also, if you have a problem locating the TV near the computer, just in your physical layout, a lot of smart TVs these days allow you to cast the picture from a computer to the TV. But I think for reliability and all that, it's better to use an HDMI cable if you can. So the last thing I want to talk about, and it's an important thing, but I'm not an expert in it, is cameras. So it would be great if you could find a sweet spot where you can get a reasonably good zoom image with a reasonably cheap camera. So I'm trying to find that still. I'm not a camera expert. You might be better off just Googling for good info. But you can use almost any camera. You can use webcams, smartphones, DSLR cameras, camcorders. But you're going to find, of course, that the image quality varies hugely, as does the price. So the connection from the camera into the computer is going to be USB or wireless. You might find, oh, your camera has an HDMI out, and hey, your computer has an HDMI connector. That's not going to work because your computer has an HDMI out as well, and you need to get HDMI into the computer. So I think there are adapters for that, but those are pretty expensive. So I'm not sure you're going to be able to get HDMI out of your camera and into the computer in a cheap way. Webcams can work. One thing about webcams you should think about is that they typically have a short focal distance, meaning that they expect the subject that they're looking at to be like a couple feet in front of the camera. And that works for the pulpit, but it's not good for like longer shots across the sanctuary. You can look online. There are hacks to increase the focal distance of a webcam, and I've played with that a little bit. Um, I would suggest you see what equipment you can get your hands on, what cameras you can get your hands on without having to buy anything, test it out, and then go from there. You can use, as you saw in the demonstration, old smartphones, and that's pretty nice when you need a wireless webcam. It's got wireless, it's got a camera, but the quality might not be as good as you would like, so give it a try. To make a smartphone a webcam, you install an app like IP Webcam or DroidX, or I think there's IVCam. There are a bunch of them. And those are for the Android. iPhone has similar things, I think. You could just run Zoom on the phone, just the camera part, not the audio. But I think I may have mentioned before that I tried doing that, and the video quality was pretty bad. Now, it was on an old phone, so maybe if you do it with a pretty new phone, that would work okay. If you're looking for an old smartphone to use for this, it doesn't have to be in great shape. So it doesn't matter if the screen is scratched. It doesn't matter if the battery doesn't hold a charge. You're just going to keep it plugged in. It doesn't need cell service. All you really need is the camera part and the Wi-Fi. Anyway, we're right now, as you saw, I'm using a couple old smartphones. I'm not crazy about their video quality. I also have a Logitech C270 at the pulpit, and I think it's okay for the pulpit, but it wouldn't be okay for kind of going a longer distance. So I'm trying to see how a better webcam would work for this, and we'll see how that goes. Thanks for watching. I hope you have found this helpful, and if you've set up a similar kind of system for your church, I'd be very interested in hearing how it turned out. Take care. Bye-bye.